What if the greatest mistake the United States ever made wasn't Vietnam or Iraq, but a failed invasion on a small Caribbean island? What if the Bay of Pigs didn't just humiliate America, but shattered its authority across an entire continent, triggering a Latin American awakening that the world was never prepared for? From a historian's lens, the Bay of Pigs was not merely a botched covert operation. It was a psychological rupture. Until 1961, U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere rested less on armies and more on inevitability. The Monroe Doctrine functioned as an unspoken law. American intervention was assumed to succeed. Resistance was assumed to fail. The collapse of that assumption mattered more than the military loss itself. History shows that empires rarely fall when they are defeated. They weaken when they are seen to be defeatable. In this alternate timeline, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 becomes more than a Cold War embarrassment. It becomes the moment the United States loses psychological dominance over Latin America. Unlike in our history, Washington's attempt to quietly bury the episode backfires. News of the failure spreads rapidly across the hemisphere, exposing U.S. vulnerability and emboldening leaders who had long resented American intervention under the Monroe Doctrine. At the center of this transformation stands Fidel Castro, no longer perceived merely as a Cuban revolutionary aligned with Moscow. Castro emerges as the ideological catalyst of continental resistance. He reframes Cuba's survival as proof that American power can be challenged. Through aggressive diplomacy, ideological outreach, and intelligence coordination, Havana positions itself as the nerve center of a Latin American anti-imperial movement. Unlike in our timeline, Castro avoids overdependence on the Soviet Union, instead promoting a third path, rooted in regional solidarity rather than proxy dependence. This shift profoundly alters U.S. strategy. Washington, expecting Europe to remain the primary Cold War battleground, finds itself strategically overstretched. The Bay of Pigs signals to Latin America that U.S. intervention is no longer inevitable or unstoppable. One by one, governments in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico begin asserting economic sovereignty, especially over natural resources. The ideological battlefield moves south. Venezuela emerges as the economic anchor of this new bloc. Learning from both Cuban resilience and Middle Eastern oil politics, Caracas nationalizes its oil sector earlier and more efficiently, avoiding the corruption and mismanagement that plagued later decades in our timeline. Instead of isolating itself, Venezuela uses oil as a diplomatic instrument, offering preferential energy agreements to Latin American neighbors in exchange for political coordination. Oil becomes not just revenue, but leverage. By the early 1970s, Venezuela leads the creation of a Latin American energy and trade community, a precursor to what the European Union would later become in Europe. Shared energy infrastructure, coordinated pricing, and collective bargaining with foreign powers give the region unprecedented economic cohesion. This bloc rejects unilateral U.S. influence outright, formally denouncing the Monroe Doctrine as an obsolete imperial relic. For the first time, Latin America speaks with a single strategic voice. Confronted with a united Latin American bloc, Washington responds with familiar tools: economic pressure, covert intelligence operations, diplomatic isolation, and attempts to fracture the alliance through bilateral incentives. Yet these tactics fail as Venezuela's control over energy flows insulates the region economically, while collective security arrangements deter military intervention. The impact on the United States is severe and long-lasting. Without guaranteed access to Venezuelan oil and compliant regional governments, Washington loses its uncontested dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The Cold War narrative changes. Instead of Berlin and NATO being the symbols of ideological struggle, Havana, Caracas, and Buenos Aires dominate global headlines. Unlike Europe's integration, which was driven by Reconstruction and U.S. patronage, Latin America's unity is forged in opposition against intervention, economic dependency, and political coercion. In this world, the United States remains powerful, but no longer hegemonic in its own backyard. The Cold War does not end with the fall of walls in Europe. It evolves into a long-term multipolar struggle where Latin America stands not as a battlefield, but as a bloc that changed global power forever. And history is left with one unresolved question. If the Bay of Pigs had unified Latin America instead of isolating Cuba, would American dominance in the Western Hemisphere have survived at all? Put your thoughts in comments.
Like, comment, share and subscribe.